Why Mendocino?
Well, by the late 60s, early 70s, the Bay Area, the city scene was getting really dangerous, amongst other things. I got to Berkeley in 69 and people were being killed because there was a lot of hard drug use. And it was harder and harder to find rehearsal space, harder and harder to, live that kind of lifestyle. And so I think people found that they wanted to, especially if they were going to raise kids, but even if they just wanted to feel safe, not have to lock their door and worry about, I had a place, when I lived in Berkeley, we had a trap door in the kitchen floor where I kept my musical instruments and my roommate kept his cameras because we couldn't keep the kids out of our house. They were going to get in and they were going to run through and grab anything they could grab. So, you moved the rug, you picked up the trap door, and that's where the saxophone lived. Otherwise, if I was out and about with my saxophone, I had it with me all the time. I graduated from college, I got my draft notice. I was too crazy to be drafted. I got a 1Y, which I worked on. There were friendly doctors at that point that would help you. And but I got really nuts, and my friends in the band in Kalamazoo, Michigan suggested I go to California and not come back. So I hit the road, I hitchhiked to California, I got to Berkeley. I had an old friend there I stayed with, and then I stayed off of Telegraph Avenue for about 2 months in a crazy house with like 12 different people living in the garage. I was living on the back porch. There were all these separate containers in the refrigerator. It was really crazy. But I did meet some musicians there and started playing mostly free jazz there, outside jazz. There was one kind of jazz funk band I played with a little bit, but the rest was just, abstract, just blowing kind of jazz. And I started, but I had taken a lot of psychedelics, because I sold LSD in 68, in the summer of 68 in Ann Arbor. So I was, at that time, that summer, I was dropping 2 and 3 times a week, because we would test everything before we would sell it. So, and then you take 2 or 3 hits, because one hit doesn't really get you off, because you've taken so much. And I was pretty much living on Dunkin' Donuts, Pall Mall cigarettes, and Coca-Cola, and I weighed 145. And I got a little healthier when I got back to Kalamazoo and got back to school and got a little better. And I fell in with a nice bunch of folks. Besides the outside jazz band, we had a street theater that we did as well. So I got to Berkeley. I played for a little while. I had a nice job where I only worked 3 months a year printing people's names on their Christmas cards. And then I spent the rest of the time riding my bicycle around and enjoying the ambience in Berkeley and playing music and writing music, starting to get into the things I wanted to do. But it still was too much for me. I pretty much blasted out my filters with all the psychedelics I took. So, if I rode my bike down San Pablo Avenue, I was reading every sign, hearing every radio, looking at every face, so your head just gets really full. And then I would go to the marina in Berkeley, and that would help air out my head a little bit. And I started going to Berkeley Zendo and sittings I was in the afternoons, and that would help. But I still felt like it was too much input. So I had a chance to come up with a gal who was coming up to visit a friend in Caspar, and I rode up with her, and to the Caspar compound, which is Ken Brandon's compound, which had been a commune, but when I got there was a village, and it was set up so that you could do whatever you wanted as part of the group or not. Everybody had their own cabin and their own little yard, and things like the vegetable garden, most of us did together. There was a wood shop, a machine shop, a library, animal husbandry. We did that together, but you didn't have to. There was no obligation. It wasn't a commune, so that was pretty cool. And I was up for a few days, and I got one of my headaches, and I went and sat by the cove, and my headache went away. So I thought that was a really good sign. And there were 3 workers who worked 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for room and board. And one of them was leaving. So I got a chance to do that. So I got back down to Berkeley and hitchhiked back up a couple weeks later with, I didn't have anything more than what I could carry in a big duffel bag anyway, so, and my horns, and I came back up and I moved into the Zendo at the compound, which was where we would sit every morning and evening, but I had a loft in it. That was my room. But then when we weren't using it as a Zendo, it was my studio. So I had my piano in there. I eventually got a piano and a guitar and a tape recorder. It was very rural. I didn't leave the place except on Saturday nights when we would go to Harold Brayton's sauna. We'd all get a sauna, and then we'd go into Fort Bragg and have a pizza. And that was the big deal. Once in a while, there'd be a party at Big River Farm, which was kind of our sister, I don't want to say commune, they weren't communes, but Big River Farm was the Zen farm up on the Kamshiukaya Road. And we would go there for, a solstice party, something like that. It wouldn't be a barbecue since they were vegetarians, or they would come to us. They had a big, we used to call them cannibal cookers. They were wood-fired hot tubs. And we had a wood-fired hot tub, so we'd fire that up and get naked and see how many people we could get in there. It was a lot of fun. There were already musicians at the compound because the Caspar Flats Jug Band played every Sunday afternoon there. And that was Bob Ross and Jan Eno and Dave Isaacson and Mark Levine, and various others, but they were the kind of the core of that band. And they played old-timey music, including a lot of very funny original tunes which they wrote. They also made hash pipes as part of the machine shop, and they were working on a steam engine prototype that they were trying to produce. And Captain Fathom would be by there, different people would come by, but it was every Sunday afternoon and evening. Bring your own wine. Everybody brought cheap wine, or we could get buckhorn for $1 a six-pack. And we were smoking really mild shake pot, which once in a while there was some hash. But usually it was pretty mellow. And they'd play, and you could play along if you wanted. My first encounter with them, some other fellows were visiting to sit in, and they had met me in Berkeley, and they knew I played guitar and banjo. So one of them said, hey, this guy plays the banjo. Why don't you have him play a tune? And they said, yeah, what do you want to play? And their thing at that time was playing really slow. They were really into relax your mind and being really slow, take it slow and easy, all those kinds of tunes, jug band music sounds so sweet, real down-tempo stuff. So I took the banjo. I said, well, how about San Francisco Bay Blues? And I started playing it in a ragtime style, which is the way my jug bands had always played. I forgot to say I was in two different jug bands in '67 before I was in the jazz band. Before I played saxophone, I played guitar and banjo and sang in two jug bands. And I started playing Got My Blues for My Baby Down by the San Francisco Bay, and I was cooking right along. I was really feeling good, and Jan Eno came up and put his hand right over the strings of the banjo while I was playing. And he said, that's not the way you play that tune. Hit it. And they played, I got the blues from my baby. And that's the way they played. And then I didn't play with them again for a couple of years. After that, I kind of slunk off. But they were older than me. They were all about 5 years old. They were all beatniks. They had some of them come from Reed College and, knew Gary Snyder and all that stuff. They were kind of before the hippies. They weren't really hippies. They were beatniks. The Caspar Flats Jug Band was Jan Eno, Dave Isaacson, Bob Ross, Mark Levine. I don't know if Alan Kendall was there yet. There were various other people that came and went, but that was the core. John Chamberlain was there. They're all in that picture of Nick's. And then my buddy Dave Jensen played washboard with them at one time. Oh, Paul Tully and Jack Sears played jugs, dueling jugs. They were the only jug band with two jugs, and they had a jug section. Actually, jug section, and Jack Sears was a potter, handmade them jugs in two different, in harmony, so they could play jug in harmony, and kazoo, and so they actually were the longest standing band on the coast. They were one version or another of Caspar Flats went for about 20 years. Because they started in the mid-'60s, and I was playing with them. I've got a tape here from 1987, playing with the Caspar Flats Rhythm and Blues Review, which is what they eventually became. At that time, so 1971, there was Cat Mother, there was the Mendocino All-Stars, and there was the Caspar Flats Band, and I think that was it. I think those were the three existent bands on the coast. There were no venues to speak of. Actually, I take that back. There was a band that played on weekends in Fort Bragg at the Club Fort Bragg, which was called, the band was called the Patchwork Company, and that was the beginning of Dirty Legs. Giannis and Bradley from Dirty Legs were in the Patchwork Company. And we would go on Sunday nights. David Alba, who eventually was in Dirty Legs and Skyhook, conga player, would pick up Davis and I, Davis DeSalle, who also played in the jug band and played later with Mark Levine, who's a wonderful lithographer, has always been a great artist. David Alba would pick us up, and we would go to the Club Fort Bragg, and we would sit in. It was an open, like a jam night. They invited us to jam. It was by invitation. And we would get all our beer and a breakfast at the all-night restaurant. And we would get to play, which was fun. And it was the first experience for me to be in a horn section. And we were doing riffs. We were a horn section that did riffs, which means you don't know what you're going to play, but you put your heads together and sing something, and then you play it the next time the chorus comes around. So you're kind of making the horn parts up as you go, and then week to week you remember what happened last week, and you play that horn part and regular horn parts. So that's the way the Count Basie band developed their horn parts. They didn't originally have written horn parts. They eventually wrote them out. It wasn't until they were a success in New York that Tommy Dorsey came to Count Basie and said, I want to buy some of your arrangements. And Count Basie said, sure, come back tomorrow. They didn't have any written arrangements. So he and a couple other guys sat up all night writing arrangements so they could sell them. Well, that's the way the horn section worked in the Caspar Flats Band. In the Patchwork Company. The Caspar Flats Band eventually had a horn section when they became a Rhythm and Blues Review. So there was the Mendocino All-Stars, Caspar Flats, and Cat Mother. There were no venues. I remember going to Crown Hall and seeing the Mendocino All-Stars, probably winter of 1971. Could have been spring of 72. I remember Cat Mother being at the what's the Albion River Inn now, but it was called something else then, down in Albion, Windjammer. I remember going out to Comshy to see Cat Mother at a bar out in Comshy. And then I saw Caspar Flats Jug Band at the Pie Wacket. And there wasn't even a stage there. They were on the floor, and some of them were on the fireplace. But that was it, and that was in 71. By 1974, there were probably 12, 16 bands on the coast and 5, 7 venues. In 1974, there was Listen, Colors, Dirty Legs, Skyhook, Mark Levine Review, Caspar Flats, Cat Mother, the Docker Hill Boys, Pennebaker Electric Band. There's probably a couple more. Those are the ones, Helios was in Albion. So that's 9 or 10, just that I can think of off the top of my head. And the venues were Toad Hall, the Foghorn, the Anchor Inn in Noyo Harbor, the Delmar West. I played there. Boy, that was a bucket of blood. I played the Delmar West. A guy was killed outside on the street on one of the breaks. And then there was and Hannigan's in Fort Bragg. And it was inexpensive enough that if you wanted to go out dancing, you could go to one club and you'd bump into somebody and would say, oh, what's going on at the Anchor Inn? They'd say, oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. It's a country rock band, whatever. Go check it out. So you could club hop. It was $2 to get in and $2 for a pitcher of beer. And you'd get the review from people as you came into another club, what was going on. So you could club hop. And there were probably only Cat Mother and the All-Stars and the Docker Hill Boys were professionals. They were actually feeding themselves with their music, though a lot of them sold drugs and gave guitar lessons too. But, and maybe they had a little garden on the side.
Who was in the Mendocino All-Stars?
Well, Andy Candanis was the drummer in the Mendocino All-Stars that was the central figure. and the band kind of revolved around him. And I think on Billy Stapleton's website it says the Mendocino All-Stars had 100 different people in, I don't know, 6 or 8 years altogether. So there wasn't anybody else, you know, that was in there for more than a few years. Kenny Sloan was a keyboard player for quite a while. Billy Stapleton was there for quite a while. Lenny Lack sang with them. Lenny Capizzi, the writer of Monster Mash, sang with them. Was somebody before Lenny, I can't think of his name, that sang in the Otis Redding style. Lloyd. Yeah, Lloyd. And it was a good band. It was a professional quality band. And they sometimes they only had one horn. I've seen them with a full horn section too, with 3 horns. The time I saw them at Crown Hall, they had 3 horns. So, and I guess they were going back and forth to the city. You know, they were in and out of here, which is the same thing with Cat Mother. They weren't always here because, you know, they were trying to make a living, which meant you couldn't do that here. So they were going wherever they had to go to play. Then the rest of the bands were all homesteaders who devoted as much of their life as they could to their music, but maybe they bought property and they were building a house, they were raising a family, and they had, most of us had a trade. You know, a lot of us were carpenters, plumbers, electricians, car mechanics. Everybody did whatever they had to do. And then, you know, so I said that's by 74. Then by 78, there's probably another 5 or 6 bands, including Philo Hayward and, you know, all the and Horst Bedortes. You know, everybody had dreams, and especially most of the bands played original material. And so there was always the hope that you would sell either the band or some of your original material. Like Skyhook, for instance, especially at the beginning, we started out as Manchild, which was a folk rock band, and we played all original things. And it kind of was like a songwriting and arranging workshop. And it was really fun that way because everybody was bringing in tunes and bringing in arrangements, and everybody was good enough musicians to pick the stuff up and play it well and sing it in harmony, and you would get to hear something that maybe was an idea, started out as an idea a week ago, was now an actual presentatable tune that people were enjoying. So, you know, and we did a demo at Wally Hyder, and there was always a chance somebody would pick up on us, but basically we were grounded in our homes and none of us wanted to go on the road. I mean, that's the thing that Dirty Legs and the All-Stars and Cat Mother were willing to do. They were willing to go on the road. And that separates the men from the boys, if you excuse the expression, because you got to really be dedicated to do that, because it means you don't have any other life. That's your life. The rest of us wanted to have a life. That's why I came up here. I didn't come up here to live in a bus, you know, in Colorado for 6 months with Dirty Legs. They asked me to join the band. They asked Davis and I to join the band in '73 and go on another tour of Colorado with them. And I got on the bus, and there was an outside boogie, a party actually at Abel Obadiah, and on the break I went around, the bus was empty, and I just got on the bus and walked up and down the aisles of the bus and said to myself, is this where I want to spend the next 6 months of my life? And I decided I would go nuts if I did that. There would, you know, the headline would be saxophone player bludgeons guitar player on band bus, you know, so goes postal. So, but Davis did go with it. Of course, every time they would go out, they would come back and they'd jump 2 or 3 more levels in their musicianship. Because that's the thing, if you play 5 nights a week, you know, the second time they came back, they would come back on April Fool's Day. That weekend, they'd always have their first boogie on the coast, usually at Toad Hall. They would play the whole weekend, sometimes 3 nights, and they would have a different show every night. They had so many tunes. But they were doing cover tunes as well. They were doing good stuff. They were doing Meters tunes and Elvin Bishop and things like that. But you know, it was just a boogie band, and that's what you did to make a living. I think Cat Mother pretty much stayed with original stuff, though they had a few things that weren't original. When I first met Lynn Keysweater and we started playing together, I suggested to Lynn that she be able to play her tunes in any configuration, whatever it called for. That she could work as a solo, a duo, a trio, or when she had the Mendonesians, we had a full band. I think sometimes there were 6 in the Mendonesians. But she could turn around the next day and play a party by herself. You know, and so that's the thing to do. If you've got the ability to sing and play and have your own style and thing, you know, And a lot of the people could do that. Don Bell did that. He could do it with the Weasel Brothers, or he could do it solo. That was another band I didn't mention, the Weasel Brothers, a country rock band. I think Philo always worked with a band. Philo could have worked as a single, but I think he always worked with a band. I saw Bob Smith solo. I saw Bob Smith solo at the old Caspar Inn before there was a stage or anything. There was just a piano tucked to the side, and in the afternoon Bob would be in there playing for tips, playing and singing. It was great. And Judy did a lot of solo work, but she also worked with Judy Mahan worked with a quartet and a trio sometimes. John Gilmore and Kiyoshi Togenaga. Yeah, excellent. And, sometimes a drummer, sometimes not. A lot is what the setting is. With jazz, there's a lot of casuals, which might be on somebody's deck or in their living room, in which case you usually don't use a drummer. But for a show like at the Seagull or Toad Hall or like that, then she could have a drummer. There's always a number of drummers. We always had a lot of drummers, in fact, which was good. The area seemed to draw great drummers, and I don't know why that is. Gene Parsons, of course, got here a year or two after me. He's a tremendous drummer. He played for a while in Caspar Flats for a couple of years, and it was just a gas playing with him because he's such a great guy and he's such a good drummer. Bill Kreutzmann. We have Ralph Humphreys now, absolute master drummer. Jimmy Hodder in Point Arena from Steely Dan. Ainsley Dunsbar was up here at one time. The drummer who drummed, he started with the Turtles, and then he drummed with Jefferson Starship. Johnny Barbado was here. Tommy Kendall, who flew under the radar. Tommy Kendall was never famous, but he was drumming with the Platters when he was 18, and a wonderful professional quality drummer. And so yeah, we were really, really lucky that way. And we had good percussionists. We had Steve Davidson on congas and David Alba on congas. I mean, for a small area, the amount of musicians here was tremendous, and I loved the fact that they were cooperative instead of being competitive. We were really lucky, and it's kind of part of the way the real rock and roll movement happened in the 60s and 70s, is most of the bands, even if they were, the guitar player and the bass player were learning on the fly, they had real drummers. They had actual professional drummers. And you can see that with Charlie Watts, and you can see that with Spirit had Cassidy, who had been a jazz drummer, and Mitch Mitchell with Hendrix. So that meant the most important thing in rock and roll, the beat, was always going to swing. It was always going to be solid. And if the bass player stumbled or the guitar player stumbled, the show went on. It didn't matter, So yeah, we were really, really lucky that way. I had lived in Ann Arbor one summer, and Ann Arbor, Michigan had a wonderful music scene as well. But I found that the different genres of musicians were very ultra competitive with each other. They didn't, the jazz players didn't play with the country players, and they didn't want to play with the classical players, and they didn't play with the rock players, and the blues players didn't like them, and there wasn't that kind of cohesiveness that we're here. You might go to play someplace, and, you got two saxophones and a banjo and a concert violinist or a concert cello player, and everybody's just having fun, everybody's just playing, and the music's just the music, and you're all playing do-right or something, It's a simple blues tune you can all play and enjoy, and I like that a lot, and it meant that the pot really bubbled here, because you could get all those different influences into every band, and that would just bring more to it, but consequently, the downside is you don't have a regional style here because it was so eclectic. Everybody was doing everything. I mean, the same band might play a Meters tune or some other funk tune and then play a country rock tune right after that. And people loved it. Nobody minded at all. But that's not actually the way, stylistic regional styles develop. Regional styles develop when everybody's on the same page. Because the genres are actually just labels for selling the music. That's what they are. So, and which bin to look in to find the album you want to find. We were, part of what happened was the Beatles blew that up for everybody. Because the Beatles just did whatever they wanted. And so we all wanted to be the Beatles and do whatever we wanted. I always wondered at the way Cat Mother would play a funk tune, and then they'd play a country tune right after that. You know, it's an actual kind of string band tune, not even like a country rock tune, but a real like bluegrass tune right after they just got done playing an original funk tune, you know, and it's just what they wanted to do. But I don't think it furthered their careers to do that, because they couldn't be put in a bag. You know, they want to know, well, what style is this? What bag is this band in? And well, this band is just playing what they want to play. They're just musicians and they play what they want to play. So, you know, and that was the existential choice they made, and they got the lives they got, you know. And I don't know, you know, I know some of them had regrets about it, some of them didn't. So, you know, that's the way. I never had any regrets because I made the conscious choice to not get on the bus. Once I made that choice, then I couldn't blame anybody but myself that I wasn't a professional musician. Yeah, and I could walk if I wanted to walk. I mean, I've been in situations where another guitar player comes and sits in and they're drowning me out, and I just pack up my horn and leave. You know, and I could do that because I wasn't depending on that $30 or whatever it was, $50 to feed my family. You know, if I had been, I would have had to just stuff my pride and be drowned out and be the saxophone mime, you know, but I wasn't going to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why even the great players like Gene Parsons dropped out, is that he could call his own shots then. You know, and he didn't get to, you know, he's not a household name like Roger McGuinn, but doesn't mean he's not as talented, and he had a wonderful life. You know, and maybe he survived longer. Tom Lear used to say, I'm always comforted when I realize that when Mozart was my age, he'd been dead for 30 years. So, you know, you don't know. Sometimes if you know, a lot of the really great musicians lived in 5-story walk-ups and ate peanut butter and died. And you know, they burned brightly for 5 years or 10 years, but they didn't survive. So for me, it was about survival. This is what it took for me to be able to survive, was to be able to walk out in the woods or go to the beach, you know, see the ocean, see the beauty of nature around me, have a garden, you know, and I don't know if you know, the music business probably would have broke me. I don't think I could have done it. We had the huge offshore oil demonstrations. We had the timber wars. When we had the timber wars, we had tree sitters right down the hill from here, and we had people sleeping in our woodshed, and we had a CB listening post for the tree sitters to all communicate. And, you know, we had that huge parade in Fort Bragg. I did a sound truck, so a band could play as part of that anti-timber parade. And that was one of the biggest things that happened. We had, you know, we had 2 or 3 summers where there was an outside boogie virtually every weekend. Either a party or open to the public or not open to the public or whatever. Someplace at the Woodlands, we did wonderful outside, and all the bands would play. Well, the big band gathering every year for 3 years was the Albion People's Fair. And that was a crafts fair, but it was pretty much just about the locals. All the local craft people would have booths. They'd mostly trade with each other. You know, the joke was the only booths that made money were the food booths, because everybody else traded, but all the local bands would play over that 3-day weekend. So when you hit the stage, you came with your best hour, and all your other music friends were out there watching, you know, so every band hit with their best stuff, and it was really fun. It was kind of like when I read about Kansas City would have the Musicians Union picnic. That was like that. Just, you know, just bring it. Bring what you got and put it out there and let everybody see it. So those were really fun musically. You know, just watching things change. I'm discouraged that there's not the youth music that there once was. You know, Bob Ayers' music program in the high school was just great for so many years. And we had a lot of young musicians come in, like Johnny Bush and Michael Ward, who came through Bob Ayers' program, and they could all read music. They all had some sense of that as well, but they liked to play rock and roll, and that was fine. And they ended up, you know, being part of the scene. Claudia Weber, you know, there was just a whole bunch of kids, but the music, you know, the schools have let the music die, so that's kind of discouraging. I got to have a great band in the 90s named Blue Bop. We were the house band for one summer at the Hill House in the lounge. We played every Friday and Saturday night. It was an 8-piece horn band, and you know, written arrangements, wonderful singer Danny Barca and Steve Steve Davidson on congas, Dan Albrecht on traps, Lonnie Nason on bass, and myself and Jim Rodseth on trumpet, and John Lundgren on horn. And we kicked ass. It was really good. And then that lasted about 5 years, and I really considered that the best band in the county for those 5 years. And then starting around '02, I was in Mambo This for 10 years, and I considered that the best band in the county. And that was really fun. What we did was we took, and this is in the tradition of Cuban music, is in the Cuban music there are maybe 100 songs that everybody knows. And some of them everybody now knows from Buena Vista Social Club, but there's a whole bunch more, and everybody knows that. That's the repertoire. That's the Cuban music repertoire. Then the bands do what they want with them. Every band plays their own version depending on the number of people and the style they want to do. So you might, if you're in Havana in the afternoon, you might see a trio singing Moliendo Cafe, and just doing it as a trio with harmonies. By the time you get to the Salsa Club at midnight, you might see a 16-piece band doing Moliendo Cafe. But of course it's a totally different version of what they're doing. So that's pretty much what we did with Mambo This. We did a few Eddie Palmieri arrangements, which were already big band arrangements. But most of the tunes, we took folkloric Cuban tunes from that repertoire and some Puerto Rican tunes, and we wrote original arrangements. Because we had Michael Hubbard, who knows the genre inside and out, and we had, I'm just looking at him, we had a great trombone player, I'll think of his name, who was able to actually write down parts as Michael sang them to him. So, that meant we could come into rehearsal and develop 2 or 3 tunes in one rehearsal that would be show ready that weekend. We'd be able to run them, and everybody was professional enough to read the charts and run the tunes. And we could sub people in and out if we needed to because we had charts, which is another thing you have to do if you're going to be a working band. But because the wedding scene was so good, people at that point, by 2002, 2003, were coming up and putting on lavish weddings. We could ask $2,000 for the band for a Saturday night. Then if I asked the band to play the Caspar the following Saturday for $50 each, nobody minded, because it was all part of that. Or if we had a benefit and we played for nothing, nobody minded because it was all part of that mixture. And we traveled a little bit. We played Sierra Nevada Festival twice. That was really fun and great. And we would go as far as Santa Rosa, Sonoma, Sebastopol, mostly for weddings. We didn't do that for club gigs. And up to Garberville and over to the valley. So we, just day trips. Once in a while we'd stay over. Or some would stay over and some would drive home. But that's kind of the high point of whatever work I've done in music, is to be able to be in a couple really good bands, professional quality bands. And part of it is I also did a lot of the organizing and managing of those bands. So then that's part of what I learned to do over the years, was call rehearsals, run rehearsals, get bookings, make posters, talk to club owners, do all that, and that just came from doing it. I didn't do that until Caspar Flat's Rhythm and Blues Review, I don't think. Well, I did it with my jug band in college. But that band had a revolving thing where somebody like John Chamberlain would book the band for a few months and then he'd burn out. And then Bob Ross would book the band for a few months and he'd burn out. And then I'd book the band for a few months. So we kind of, since it was a collective, we kind of took turns doing that. And, besides being a great guy, John was so naturally talented and so easygoing about it that he never tried to force anything, and there never were any events with him where he walked out of a rehearsal that I know of, or he tried to impose himself on something. All he did was come and just play beautifully, and he would play so beautifully that it would stop the show. He was self-taught, but his understanding, what he learned to do as far as my ear is, there's a thing called chromatic substitutions. So many people don't know that you can substitute some chords for other chords. The jazz players do this all the time. They take the progression that the tune was written in. You know, I got rhythm, and then they'll substitute other chords in there and kind of stretch the tune by substituting the chords. Well, there's a thing called chromatic substitutions that allow you to slide up and down the neck of a stringed instrument and do that. And John heard that. He could do that. So he wouldn't be playing what the other strings would be playing, but he would be enhancing what they were playing. And the mandolin, the steel mandolin he had, would stand out. So you'd always hear him, but he never was in that situation where he was just piling on with everybody else. He was always adding his own voice into what they were doing. You know, for a performer, he wasn't what you would call a show business type. He wasn't a self-promoter, you know. And of course his artwork speaks for itself. His artwork was great. When he got into Caspar Flat's Rhythm and Blues Review, one of the funny things that happened was my great friend Bob Treadwell also joined the band. Now, I'm going to circle all the way back to 1971. The first horn section was with Bob Treadwell and Davis Tissell, and a guitar player and bass player from Point Arena, Barry Bastian and Gary Bloom. And Barry did B.B. King style tunes, and he wanted a horn section. So we developed a horn section, did some rehearsing, did a couple of gigs with him. But later on, when we added Bob Treadwell into Caspar Flats, Bob was a great guy, but he was high strung. He was just and very strong, and could be scary to some people but he was totally nonviolent, but he just was high strung and a big strong guy. And he came into the band when John Chamberlain came into the band, and it was perfect. Because if Bob was over on one side of the rehearsal room stressing about something, Chamberlain was laughing over on the other side, and it would dissipate any stress in the room to have the two of them in the band. So I think part of it was the hierarchy. You know, the jazz musicians really got screwed by the rock musicians. I mean, and me being one of them. But there were jazz musicians that might have had a gig for 5 years at a supper club and were master musicians and came in one night, and three skinny guys who had to look at the necks of their guitars to play had stolen their gig to play three chord tunes, you know, monotonous, repetitious, oversimplified tunes to the jazz players. So the jazz players kind of got bitter because they lost their jobs in an absurd way. They didn't get beat out of their job by somebody with better chops. They got beat out of their jobs by somebody who needed a bath. You know, I mean, the saying is, the more chords, the less money. That's one of the great things about playing. It's just the way the personalities meld and work out, and it doesn't always fit. And sometimes two great players cannot play together. You know, we had a thing on the coast where we had Kiyoshi Tokunaga, John Gilmore, Kent Glenn, and Fred Ralston all here. And all four of them are wonderful professional jazz players. John and Kiyoshi could play together, but they never played with Kent, and they never played with Fred. And I still don't know why, because it would have been like a super group. I could see in that jazz grouping that every one of those guys had some reason that he really considered himself the best of those four, mostly by who you've played with. Like Kiyoshi had played with Howard McGee, who had played with Bird. So Kiyoshi was like one step removed, and he recorded with Jimmy Giuffre. You know, Kent Glenn wrote and arranged for the Jerry Mulligan Band, and you know, and Doc Severinson's band, you know, and Fred Ralston had been a talent deserving wider recognition in Downbeat in 1981. You know, so they all had this little thing. So who's the leader? In other words, you know, so there couldn't really be any leader, and they were all stylists, and they never were able to meld. John and Kiyoshi did. But I was never able to hear the other folks play together. So, though they were all great, and they were great teachers, and they helped us a lot. They all added. Even if, for me as a rhythm and blues player, to get a chance to study jazz with Kent Glenn or with Kiyoshi had to enhance whatever else I did. I mean, I loved listening to jazz anyway, and I play it now. But at that time, it was an in for me to start to learn about it, not just the techniques and the ideas. But, you know, Kiyoshi epitomized what the real New York jazz is, which is as serious as your life. You know, Kiyoshi would say, when you play, when you're bad, when you have a bad night, that's as good as you can play. he also said that when you practice, remember it may be the last time you ever play. So that's the kind of, seriousness about the music in a good way that he brought to it, even though he's a very sweet man, and I still love him dearly. Another band I didn't mention in that early thing of the 1974 bands was Hanson and Raitt, and John Gilmore played with them. So did Jeff Barone from Dirty Legs, who also was a jazz drummer, as well as being a rhythm and blues and rock drummer. He's another one of the great drummers that were here that could play anything. And John did a great job with Hanson and Raitt. It was really fun. He add in synthesizer to that stuff and keyboards. Well, one of the other great things in my music life was I got to do some gigs at the Sequoia Room with John Gilmore, just with flute and piano and bass. And that was just great. And it was great for my playing as well because John played very sparsely in it, kind of Bill Evans style. And so I really was out there. I didn't have a lot. I used to play with Richard Cooper as well, who was another wonderful professional jazz musician who was here. And Richard would always kind of be there backing me up. Whenever I made a mistake, he would make it sound okay on the piano. But with John, I had to really be fully there. And it was a great treat. It was really a great treat to play with him. What a wonderful man. Greg DeGelli played bass. We started out, we did one with just piano and flute. And then Greg asked to sit in, and then it sounded so good we started having Greg play bass. So Greg comes over from Chico. And Greg's been a professional his whole life. He's a bass player and tenor sax player.
Tell me a little bit about Lenny, what you remember about Lenny.
Well, Lenny was another one of the musicians here who was a professional musician. I mean, that's one of the hierarchies there were. And for a while, it was very hard to connect. Us, the amateur or semi-pro players like myself weren't able to connect with the pros because they have a certain amount of prestige and status themselves. And I think it partly comes from the fact that they were struggling for gigs and to feed their families as well. And maybe they took umbrage to all these self-subsidized players coming in with their vanity projects, which they basically were. But, Lenny had been a professional, and then Lenny had been a songwriter, and at first, Lenny didn't really have any time for me. He was just with those guys, the guys the in crowd, the music in crowd. But then when he realized how much I knew about rhythm and blues and how much I enjoyed rhythm and blues, which he did. In fact, one of the first times I remember talking to me, he sat down next to me at the Caspar Inn and we were having a beer and he said, "Professor Longhair, man, have you checked out Professor Longhair?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Oh yeah, check him out, and he was right. And next time I saw him, I said, "Yeah, man, that's the shit, that's the stuff." So, and Lenny was another one who could work solo, duo. He could front the Mendocino All-Stars if he wanted. I don't know, at a certain point he became an accountant. And I can't remember exactly when that was, but I'm sure he was trying to have a more real cash flow so he could have a little financial security, which wasn't going to come from playing music and writing music. That's, hit or miss. And listening to the early recordings of him, I really hear what a great voice he had. Because later on, when he was only singing sporadically, he would sing out once a month or whatever. He still sang really good, but you don't hear, his voice isn't as good as when he was playing every night and singing professionally. And he's a crusty guy. Lenny was a crusty guy. Part of the reason we hit it off as well was that we both like sports. And most musicians don't bother with sports. Music is kind of their sport. And there's a few of us who do music and sports. He even told me in his last days, he said, "Yeah, my musicians friends don't like sports and my sports friends don't know music. So you're the only one." So we would do that. We could sit down and talk about Memphis and the Toronto Blue Jays, in the same same sentence. So, and there's analogies and there's ways that stuff goes together. So, but yeah, I miss Lenny. I enjoyed his company quite a bit. Later on, but I try to put some extra time and give back to him. Once he was laid up, I know how lonely that is. I had a couple of weeks in the hospital myself, which is small compared to what he did, but I know how time stops if you don't have somebody to talk to and how miserable that can be. So I thought, well, what the hell, why can't I have an hour once a week and just enjoy his company and give back a little bit for all the times I'm in the back playing horn and he's singing Walking the Dog and we're having a great time, So That's kind of Lenny in his prime when you see him there, because he would really front the band. He would direct the band. He'd make sure they knew if he was going to do stops, you know. All those things he'd direct with his guitar, and he was just a natural talent. But, you know, America eats its artists, so that's the deal. You don't really get the support that you would get if you were in Japan as an artist, or Vienna, you know. So. But yeah, it was great to have him on the scene, and always a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and he'd sit in and have a good time, and then we'd go and see the Whales, and they were fun. We had a good time watching them. Sometimes they'd even have drums. Usually they didn't. They'd always have Steve on congas. Once in a while they'd have Richie on drums too, so they could expand out to a dance form. You know, there's two different models. There's the model of the expert. You know, the last few hundred years, we've had these experts who, you know, come up and they're, you know, world class in one thing or another. Or sometimes they're discovered as kids, and they're savants, and you know they do nothing but play cello or play tennis or do something, you know, and they become these super amazing maestros of whatever they do. But that's a new model. The old model, and the model that still went on, it still goes on a lot of places, is that people raise their families, have their homestead, and they put their hearts into their creativity as well. I mean, the art that's created by the Indians in British Columbia is amazing and world class, and they just do that in the winter when they can't work. They work really hard all summer, and then in the winter they carve masks and they write songs and they sing and play, and you know, like the story where the archaeologist goes to the island and says, "Where's your art?" And they say, "Everything we do is art." You know, and there's no art. In Bali, the gamelan, which is the orchestra, is the instruments. It's not the players. And the gamelan has its own pagoda it lives in. And if there's a holiday coming up, different people volunteer to be in the orchestra. Some might be in the dancers. Some might be in the chorus. Some might be doing the shadow puppets. But it's not the same people the next holiday. And some are in the audience. You know, the art is integrated with their lives, which is the way I feel we've been able to do here, which I think enhances everything you do. You know, it certainly gives me a release. I could come home from a hard day of trying to build something and be able to relax and, you know, play music. And of course, some of it is all the energy I had, you know, and a lot of people did, which meant we could work all day and play all night. And you see that in other scenes as well. I mean, Buddy Bolden had a day job. He was a barber, so a lot of the early New Orleans musicians had day jobs, and which is fine, you know. But it's different, and I have to understand that it's not the same as if I were playing 5 days a week or practicing, you know, 40 hours a week. I met a young saxophone player at the Sequoia Room about 5 years ago. That he was with the Monk Institute band, which was all kids who were getting their master's degrees in jazz, and he was an Israeli guy, and he just played tremendous saxophone, wonderful original tunes. And we were talking on the break, and I said, "Well, you represent somebody who's played 40 hours a week for 10 years, and I represent somebody who's played 10 hours a week for 40 years." And we laughed about it. So, well, you know, and I often wondered how that also affected the community, in that when they were going to see a show, they would go in the club, and it wasn't some aliens on stage who lived in their own little bubble of being artists. It was the guy who had been doing their roof or doing their plumbing, or, you know, selling them auto parts or fixing their car, showing them that, yeah, this is possible too. You can go home and paint a picture if you want. There's no reason you shouldn't. Or do a sculpture, or, you know, whatever else you want to do in your life. If you have the time and energy, we're fortunate enough to have that. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it's not possible in all cultures in all ways, because people, all they can do is work. They exhaust themselves working. So we're fortunate that I mean, my father would come home from work and sit in his chair and watch TV, and that was it, because he worked so hard to, you know, raise a family.
Can you give me a brief reminiscent of your brief run-ins with Jim Ford and what a kind of a character he was?
Oh, you know, I worked on his house. That's how I met him. And but he wasn't really that social. I didn't even know who he was. He just seemed like a nice little old guy who had retired up here, but was basically a hermit. He had a nice dog he loved, and he was renting Richard Mabbitt's old place down the road from here, and it needed a roof. So I worked on that, but I never really talked music with him. And then I found out later, oh, he was the same as music guy. And then I would see him in passing, but, you know, we've had various celebrities up here. Bonnie Raitt was up here, and, the guy from Taxi and Back to the Future. Christopher Lloyd lived up here. And, you know, I saw Christopher Lloyd at the Mendocino Cafe, but I wasn't going to hit on him or bug him. He didn't come up here for that. That's what I felt about Jim Ford. If he wanted to talk, great. But if he was up here to get away from being social, that's great too. You know, same thing with Bonnie Raitt. I'm not going to bust her on the street and go, oh, Bonnie Raitt. You know, just leave her alone. That's something I can give her in return for what she's given me, is not bug her. You know, so I didn't bug Jim Ford, but I would see him, and he seemed like a nice enough little guy, but I don't know that much about him. Well, I guess Joel Scott Hill had property up on Docker Hill. And then there's a clip on YouTube of a really early version of the Docker Hill Boys with Stevie Gurr playing guitar, and Gene Parsons, I think it's Gene on drums, if I remember right, and Chris Etheridge is playing pedal steel, and Graham Keeley is playing bass. And they said that was the Comshy Volunteer Fire Department benefit band. So that was kind of the start of that. They put that band together for a benefit dance for the Volunteer Fire Department. And then, you know, it was primarily people around Joel Scott Hill would be the Docker Hill Boys. You didn't necessarily know who else would be there. Chris Etheridge was there some of the time. You know, they all had other gigs. They would, you know, they'd be down in L.A. recording. I mean, Etheridge recorded with everybody. So, and you know, Gene might be there. Kreutzmann might be on drums. You know, it just depended who was around and available. Tommy Kendall might be on drums. You know, and they were pros. They played a good style of country rock. I never saw them with Booker, but Booker played with them, I understand. Yeah, I read it someplace that Booker had played with them. But yeah, and they were serious musicians, and they were good at what they did. Well, Skyhook started out as Manchild, which was a folk rock band. We had a 12-string guitar, and we had a banjo, and we had a auto harp, and we had all these guitars. Eric Kohlberg was in there. Eric Kohlberg was actually in the first professional rock band from the area, which was from Fort Bragg, the Living Children. And they had a hit, which is online, but they never recorded an album. They were a one-hit wonder. And Eric's a wonderful guitar player. He still plays guitar. He plays jazz guitar now and gypsy guitar. And he's still in Fort Bragg. Bruce Graves, Gary Evangelista, a guy named Cochise. I don't know what Cochise's last name was. He was from Louisiana. Richard Stump on drums. And it was like a songwriter's workshop. We all brought songs in, original songs. We even brought songs that other people had written and friends of ours had written and developed arrangements for them. And we played a few gigs around. At that time, that was before the club scene had opened up. So we played the Blue Moon Bar in Comshy, which is now the Comshy School, when it opened. And we played the Studio, which was a big coffee house in Mendocino. But there weren't a lot of gigs yet. That was the very beginning. And then as the gigs opened up, that band broke up. And then Bruce and I were still there to have Skyhook. And who else? Eric was in the original Skyhook. And a couple other folks. I can't think of the drummer's last name, but he eventually owned the Foghorn. But and we were doing original rock and some cover stuff, and we were just on the boogie scene, you know. And basically, you know, I mean, I got into rock and roll to get loaded and laid. I'm just another geek, and if you're not the quarterback on the football team and you want to get loaded and laid, if you play some good music, you know, you got something to talk about at least. So and we just happened to be coming along when everything was opened up. So we played a lot. We played a lot with Dirty Legs when they were in town. They were kind of like our sister-brother band, whatever, because we were all good friends with them. And we and Dirty Legs had a real blue-collar attitude. They were really down to earth. And I think those guys were all working-class guys. And you know, they supported us and we supported them. And the most fun is we would do gigs together at Toad Hall, where we'd alternate sets. So there wouldn't even be really breaks. There'd be about 10 minutes between set. You could just fill the night with music, and everybody would get to party and play. And you could play your best stuff and try to, you know, show the other band what your new stuff was. So, and Skyhook was together from 73 to about 79. Yeah, and with all, you know, Michael Ward was in there quite a bit. Mark Safran, Denny Lunsford was in there a lot. Another good guitar player. And Mark Lanero was the drummer. David Albo for a while before he went off with Dirty Legs. And at one point we had 8 of us. We had 2 lady singers. And that's when we did the recording at Wally Hyder. We had coke dealers for our managers. That was fun. They were LA Hells Angel bikers who had left the biker scene and moved up here and were coke dealers. So we all blew our sinuses out. And the recordings are too fast. We're playing, you know, we're not only playing too fast, everybody's playing everything they can at every moment, you know. It's like, it's high energy, but there's no dynamics, you know. It's just like, but we had a lot of fun with it, though. And I said to Bruce the other day, you know, listening back to those recordings, a friend of ours just took the recordings we had and enhanced them and put them on CDs and like that. And, you know, listening back, yeah, it's not as good as it could have been. There's a lot of things that I would have preferred. But Bruce said, you know, we made a lot of people happy. And I said, that's the stuff. You know, that was something we did in the community. We made ourselves happy and we made a lot of people happy. So good fun. A big part of it was the demographic. At that point, you know, in the 70s here, you know, probably 60% of the people living on the coast were between 20 and 35. We didn't have big families. We didn't have big mortgages. It was really inexpensive to live here. There was a building boom, so people could go into construction. You could fish. You could log. There were all kinds of things you could do to make a living besides, and then party. And everybody did. Most of the places like Toad Hall were family friendly. They had a big place in the corner where all the kids would be in their sleeping bags. And there was a little narrow entranceway so one parent could sit there and take turns during the boogie and watch all the kids in their sleeping bags. And then at the end of the night, they'd pick the kid up, sleeping bag and all, and take him home. Or they'd be asleep in the parking lot. But they had that little kids camp. And, you know, beer and wine. It was a beer and wine scene. Caspar Inn came later. The Caspar Inn was going with music in the 70s. I played a gig with Skyhook there probably in 76, but we just played in the corner for beer. There was no stage or anything. But that, you know, that was part of that 80s music scene that was really great that came out of the Caspar Inn. Same thing with the Seagull. The Seagull didn't have music till the late 70s. You know, they kind of came, and that was another great music scene. So, but the pot kept cooking, and people kept mixing and matching, and we had all kinds of good music going on, and the symphony, and the Bob Ayers College of the Redwoods big band. You know, so we had big band music as well. And, you know, later on we had a steel drum band. I mean, there's been all kind of creative, good bands here doing all different things.
Billy Shea took on that name, Blind Willie Shea. Did you know Billy when he was here?
Yeah, only a little bit. I lived in Caspar when he lived in Caspar, and he and Lenny and Peter had a band they called Cheese. And they played in the corner at the Caspar Inn.
And that would be Peter Oliva.
Yeah, Peter Oliva, and that was probably 1974. And I said to Billy, I said, how come you named your band Cheese? You know, we were all trying to have clever band names. And he said, oh, everybody likes cheese. So, but yeah, I never quite knew, you know, what the rest of his story was, because he was around for a little while. And he's on that video from 1978 playing at the Woodlands with, I don't know what they were calling themselves at that time, P&E or... you know, it's Cat Mother. It's one of the variations of Cat Mother. They're all on stage, and it's Cat Mother, but also John Chamberlain and Billy Shea and an unknown horn player. And who else? There's a whole gang of them. It's outside boogie at the Woodlands. Richie's drumming. So it's right at that point when they're starting to morph into horse parades. But I think Bob had come up. I think Bob was already in the city, but I think Bob had come up to play, and they all knew the tunes. Steve Davidson's on stage, and they all knew those tunes. Yeah, it's like a huge all-star band. Unfortunately, the video doesn't have sound, but we used one of the Cat Mother recordings with the video, so there'd be some sound. Well, Clay Pennebaker was a wonderful electric guitar player. Played too loud, but I think most of them do. But he was a wonderful player. And then they had a guy named Ferenc, who I think was from the Czech Republic, who played and sang and wrote. And in 1978, they had evolved to where Bradley Boo was no longer in the Dirty Legs, because he had decided to be a homesteader and raise a family, have 3 daughters. But he was playing with them on bass and singing. And Peter Lombardi was the drummer. He's a great drummer. He also played with Skyhook. Peter Lombardi. Skyhook, like a lot of the bands, had probably 8 different drummers over the years. But the rotating drummer thing, and of course the problem with the rotating drummer thing is nobody read charts. So every time you changed drummers, you had to take a month off and teach them the book before you could play again. You know, sometimes the old drummer would be gracious enough to keep playing while you were teaching the new drummer, but and Pennebaker did mostly original stuff. It was a nice band. It was kind of I don't know, it was just a rock band. I can't remember what made them so distinct. They started out, they had a wonderful vocalist with operatic chops that I think was Clay Pennebaker's cousin, and she was the lead singer. So she could really put the sound out there. But they were only on the scene for, I'm going to say about 3 or 4 years. Listen was another band like that. Listen was a band that was on the scene for a couple, 3 years. And they were kind of a folk rock band, original. They had 4 or 5 players, and I can hardly remember who was with them. But they would have a light show. They were one of the bands that had a light show with their music. There was a guy who was the leader, and I can't think of his name, and he was the songwriter and lead singer. But they were called Listen. And then, Philo came on the scene, and Philo had the shuffle band for all those years. Philo really got going because Hannigan's started having country rock 3 to 5 nights a week. And he had the house band gig for probably 4 summers. There's a gas station now there where Hannigan's was. Hannigan's was Tom and Jerry's, which was the old one of the tough places. They used to say, let's go to Tom and Jerry's for a shot and a beer and a bloody nose. And then Ed Hannigan bought it, and he liked music, and he got Philo in there, and there were 4. There was Philo, Tom Quinn on pedal steel, Johnny Robin on rhythm guitar. Can't think of the bass player's name right now, or I don't know who the drummer was either. Might have been Tommy Kendall on drums. But that was a decent gig. I mean, those guys working 3 to 5 nights a week and maybe giving some guitar lessons could actually feed themselves. They couldn't buy property, but they could feed themselves and get by. And that worked out for Philo. And then I played later with Philo and the Rockos. There was a band named the Rockamatics in the 80s that my bass player buddy Bruce put together. And they would back Philo, and I got in on some of those gigs. And we would alternate. So we would do a set of rhythm and blues, and then we'd do a set of country rock with Philo. So I got to play with Philo a little bit. And that was fun. Philo was a great guy. Really an entrepreneur. He put those bands together in that recording studio. But he always played the same tunes. When he came back from Mexico for the reunion, he brought his Mexican band with him. So this is like 2003. And we're all jamming and having a great time. And on the break, I'm talking to his alto player, and I say, Philo's playing the same tunes he played in 1980. And he says, oh yeah, we call his book the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I'm sure he had added some tunes, but he did a wonderful thing down there in Mexico. He really brought the standard of living in that town way up. He opened a club in La Cruz, which is somewhere around Baja on the coast, and it became a stopover for people who like to sail around all over the place and find cool places to stop and hear music and eat. So there started to be this revenue source in town. People would stay there and they'd come in. And then Philo got a community library going, and then he got a school going. So he's a big hero there. He passed away about 7 years ago. he couldn't make a go of his studio because he couldn't get enough of the rock people to come this far out of L.A. to do it. You know, he thought he would put them up. They'd bring their families. There were horses, a pond. You know, he'd bring their families. They'd all come up and stay for 3 weeks and make an album. But I don't know if anything ever happened that way there. I was there for Little World. That was fun. Bonnie Raitt was there, and every local musician is on that thing, singing at least in the chorus. So that was a fun thing. That was Lenny's tune. Well, that was the two Louis at that point, and they
was the two Louis, right?
They were doing the production for Philo, and they were living at Booker T's place. They were renting Booker T's house. It was after Booker T went back, and Priscilla, Booker T's wife, was here. I never saw her, but one of her, Rita Coolidge is one of her sisters, and then there's another sister, Linda Lou, who would play occasionally. And she played occasionally, just like Gene Parsons would have had bands on and off as well. There's the new trio album of that, but he also had a quintet at one time too, and he would put together different bands. You know, people could do that because the quality of the musicianship was good enough that there was going to be a concert on Saturday night. You could get together a couple afternoons and put a show together, you know, and do a good job on it. It would be professional quality. Yeah, and we did a lot of benefits for a lot of people, for a lot of causes. One of the funny benefits we did a benefit at the old Apple Hall, which is now a clothing store and art gallery in Mendocino. But it was Apple Hall at that time. It hadn't been divided up into shoppies. And we played, and Hanson and Raitt played, and I'm not sure who else. I think it was Listen. And during our set, they passed a hat around to collect money. It was for United Stand. We were fighting them trying to bulldoze our cabins. The building department wanted to bulldoze our cabins. So it was this benefit for United Stand. And and somebody's got a brand new Stetson cowboy hat, and they pass it around, and somebody runs off with it out the door. They not only lose all the contents, the guy loses his new cowboy hat. So Norman was really great. And Norman was really our voice on the Board of Supervisors. But it was really grassroots. You know, when they started red tagging people's cabins, which meant they wanted to demo their cabins, you know, somebody called the building department and said, you know, if you come with a bulldozer, you're going to be on Channel 7 live to San Francisco bulldozing over people in the neighborhood. And they said, oh man, maybe we should talk about this. You know, because people just weren't going to, we weren't going there. We were going to let them bulldoze people's homes. Well, a lot of, you know, so many of the buildings just evolved. They started out as, you know, chicken sheds, you know, chicken coops, and they evolved, and now there's these beautiful houses around them. But that was just the organic way people did, and a lot of people started with outhouses. You know, we all had outhouses, and I had an outhouse with a hole in the roof. You had to wear your rain hat when you used the outhouse. So, well, it circles round and round. I mean, I know some of the kids who grew up here who are very bourgeois now. They were just absolutely repulsed by growing up hippie, and some of them are hippies today, and they love it here, and they still like to live funky and down to earth and have their own garden, and they don't mind taking a shower outside. You know, certain amount of the parents who were, you know, the kids were free range for good or bad. You know, that's the way the Star Road kids were. They were the free range kids. But they ran around in a gang of 7, 8 of them. They had a big dog with them, and sometimes the older sister or brother would keep a half eye on them, and they had a great time. You know, kids today don't get to do that. They don't get to run, and you don't have that mixing of all ages of kids, which is really healthy. Mm-hmm. You know, so, but in other ways it was funky. Some of them didn't have fathers. You know, they had outhouses. There was, you know, other stuff going on. And people OD'd. There were people who OD'd. There was most of the drug use was pretty much up stuff. You know, with psychedelics and pot, and then people got into coke heavily. But and some of the people were into downers and speed, but not that much, comparatively. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. I wanted to quote, maybe you already have Steve Davidson quoting this, but I was talking about the demographics of the rock scene. He said it was after birth control and before AIDS. So, I mean, the rut was on when you get that many young people and you have birth control, and everybody's boogieing and partying and, you know, recreationally drugging. You know, Oh, well, here's one of the downsides. There was a point about 1975 when I think a third of the boys in the Mendocino school had no fathers. So there was some bullshit. You know, there's some definite bullshit going on. A lot of water under the bridge. But we had a good time. we really had a good party. And, you know, and mostly, not many people were hurt or crushed or anything by it. There were people who were self-destructive. And, you know, a certain amount of people went down. And living was funky and people got scabies, you know, and had to abandon their cabins. And, you know, people had fires in their cabins. And, you know, there's a certain amount of stuff I think we blew right past that would gross us out now. Because we had so much personal momentum. You know, Busby burned up in his cabin, you know, okay, where's the boogie? You know, it was like, you know, you're 28 and everything's on.